Hi everyone, it's Janice from the Divorcing Religion podcast. Did you know that it costs me money to produce each episode of this podcast? I'd really appreciate your help to keep my show on the air and helping other people. Please join me over on Patreon, where you can also find commercial-free episodes, and the links are in the show notes. Thanks so much. Hi everyone, welcome to the Divorcing Religion podcast. I'm your host, Janice Selby. I'm a registered professional counselor and a religious recovery consultant. My guest today is Dorian Ortega. Dorian is a licensed clinical professional counselor and founder of F.L.Y Radical Therapy, LLC. First, love yourself. F.L.Y Radical Therapy is a therapeutic approach centering BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ and loving yourself through collective social liberation awareness, healing for yourself and with each other, and helping others to get there. F.L.Y Radical Therapy is inspired by liberation, womanist, and multicultural psychology. Glancing at the FLYRadicalTherapy.com website, I was captivated to see how Dorian and her colleagues are working to dismantle patriarchy and foster healing by teaching about agreements and boundaries and building awareness around systemic oppression. Welcome, Dorian.
Thank you.
It's so nice to see you. And I'm in Canada. You're in the United States. Our backgrounds are, pretty different from one another. When I came across your website, I just felt so compelled to reach out because I love the way that you're doing therapy and the issues that you are working with people on. So I'm really glad you had time to join me this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
And your background is Puerto Rican, or that's part of your heritage. I've never been to Puerto Rico. And so what's it like then? That's part of your heritage, but you actually live in one of the United States, one of the other places there. What's that been like?
Yeah. So I was born in Chicago. My family migrated from Puerto Rico in the 60s during the great waves of migration from folks from the island to Chicago looking for work and dealing with the impact of colonization of Puerto Rico. One of the many ways that colonization has impacted individuals has been limiting the resources that they have access to on the island. And so that might include limiting and controlling land and how folks can use the land and what they can grow, what they can't grow, who serves in the army, what ways that folks can participate in the colonization or support it, and how that power just kind of has affected opportunities for folks on the island and for many years, including until today. And there are many resources to show that there has been this intentional erasure of people. And so if folks want to learn more about that, please look into The War Against Puerto Ricans. It is a book that is, I think, really helpful to understand the impact of colonization right here and an island that's really close to the United States. Mm-hmm. And so growing up Puerto Rican in Chicago meant that there was a diaspora of people that have, grown together and kind of found each other, right? And to build community together. Mm-hmm. And that looked like finding celebrations, finding community, finding the food and the culture and the traditions and family. That meant what ways can we embrace our identity, as well as find ways to adjust to our surroundings and how we support each other and deal with the way that systemic or oppression affects people here in the United States as people of color. And so Puerto Ricans and the Puerto Rican diaspora have very much complex experiences with identity. Racism is not very much a named ideology in Latin America. It's something that is very nuanced to the United States and very black and white. And in Latin America and many other parts of the world, colorism and classism are much more obvious issues that folks deal with. And so those nuances have been like the complexities that have continued to really like perplex me and interest me and charge me in many ways to understand how that affects how our psyche and how we think and how we feel about ourselves and the things that we do and participate in and who we interact with and what we believe in.
Yes. And thank you for that. That is such a great introduction. And so your family moved to Chicago, and then, so you grew up, Chicago is the only place, or it's the main place that you've known in your life when you've been growing up.
Yes.
And so did your family kind of make connections right away with other people who had moved there from Puerto Rico? Did they already know people?
The way that, right, like the waves, and how many people who immigrate outside of a country, right, like find their people. And so I think on both sides of my family, there were already people living here in Chicago who they were able to connect with and build families from there.
Okay. And I mentioned to you that one reason I was so interested and grateful that you agreed to come on the show is because I grew up in an evangelical bubble that was also very white and very patriarchal. And so even though I left religion some 14 years ago, I still am just finding out that I have so many blind spots when it comes to my own I hate even to use the word, but yes, racist ways of thinking that I'm not even aware of. And same with also patriarchy. And my daughters sometimes have to remind me and say, no, Mom, that's not right. You don't have to do that, or you don't have to think that way. But even though I've been out of it for over a decade, still the water that I'm swimming in is a patriarchal society. I'm in Canada, so, pretty much like the United States and much of the Western world. So yes, that's why I was really grateful to have you on. And I wonder, since the show, the name of the show is Divorcing Religion, has religion played any role in your life? Were you raised with any kind of religious beliefs?
Sure. Yeah. First, born and raised in the church as well. So part of my maternal side, well, both sides of the family. Paternal side was more connected to Catholicism. And my mother's side was Protestant and part of the United Church of Christ umbrella church organization. And so our church, the church I grew up in, was one of the first Spanish-speaking churches of the organization. There's two in Chicago, and the idea of United Church of Christ is to center justice or social justice. And so the church that I grew up in was Protestant. And part of my experience was going since I was born, right? Like you go every Sunday, and the church becomes your family. The church is the family. The many family members made up the church. And my experience was very much a weekly experience. So I was there every Sunday, like clockwork, and participating in children ministry and reading the texts, even being called to preach, singing the songs, holidays, right? Easter was the jam with, having the organized ways to gather children and families. And then my experience was also interesting in that, because I didn't find this out later until I was an adult, and I learned about radicalizing, or I was radicalized, I think, in college. And so growing up in the church, I grew up in a church with pastors who were very passionate about the Puerto Rican independence movement. And at the time of the Puerto Rican independence movement, which has historically been a part of Puerto Rico's history, in Chicago, we have our history in political organizers who we refer to as freedom fighters, who challenged the government on how they're participating in violence against Puerto Rico with the current state of colonization. And so that included several different acts to call attention towards Puerto Rico's current state, and that resulted in many people being arrested for their political beliefs and activism, and what we refer to as political prisoners, who were charged with seditious conspiracy and things of that nature, and experienced very long prison terms.
Wow.
And President Obama just recently released one of the last Puerto Rican political prisoners before his term ended, which was for Oscar López Rivera. And so this group of people, referred to as FALN, were a group of folks fighting for liberation, and some of them were members of the church. In fact, one was the pastor's wife, and the wife's her son, and many close friends who I found out later, as an adult, because I grew up with folks, and me and many other members of the church were not aware that folks were organizing in the church. And so there's a very strong connection to this particular church being a radically, open, politically supportive church towards the movement of Puerto Rico and social justice. And so that's my exposure and involvement to that extent, outside of how the religion itself has been set up, and just understanding the patriarchy around that. That also is included in my experience, in my upbringing in that church, is that I witnessed people be released from prison for the things that they believed in. And I saw the fear of how the government, of what the government did to certain spaces that did support the independence of Puerto Rico, and how that scared many people out of the church. So that's been the very nuanced experience that I have had in the church that I specifically grew up in, and how that church and the church organization had advocated for the release as well of Oscar López Rivera and other political prisoners.
So it sounds like your church experience, your religious experience was, quite powerful, very social justice oriented. That is not the case for so many churches, but there are Christian churches today still that are, when we talk about being the hands and feet of Jesus, that's really how they position themselves. They do want to try and make a difference in the world. So you grew up being introduced to belief in Jesus or Christianity from a young age. And then you mentioned something about being radicalized or coming to understand radicalization in college. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So part of my background is I majored in psychology, and I minored in Latin American and Latino studies. And so I took a class on Puerto Rican studies, one of the only that probably, exists maybe in New York, and maybe Chicago might be the only other one. But I took a history of Puerto Rico studies course, and the course included the history of the independent movement fighters. And I found out how I was connected to that because I grew up in a church that didn't talk about that very openly. There was a lot of fear instilled. An example is that, undercover federal officers did intimidate church members. And so I didn't find this out until later in life when I was an adult and understood that, I made some connections and understood why people didn't talk about it and why people weren't filling the church pews like they used to. And so it made me understand and appreciate that, I guess, how powerful the systems are, right? And even as powerful as, the religion itself, right? Religion holds a lot of power. And so there's like some ways that this government protects religion in different ways. And then depending on who the people are, there's many ways that it doesn't protect them, even if there is religion involved. And so I think being people of color, being Puerto Rican specifically, has been the experiences of people of color within the churches is that, I don't know what it is like to grow up in a white dominant church, but I certainly know it's like to grow up in a Puerto Rican dominant church that had this extra layer of social justice, and the treatment that they received, I don't think would have happened if they were a white dominated church.
Right. Yeah. I think you're probably very right there. And so, what was your experience, or maybe I even misunderstood? Did you feel at some point that you became radicalized? Was it to do with Puerto Rican causes, or was it to do with
causes? Yeah, I was radicalized to understand the how systemic oppression works in different ways for people of color, and how the society, or how the government and how society has shifted and changed for certain groups and not for other groups, and just the evolution of oppression in this country, and what does it look like for these people and these people. And so part of that meant to continue to nurture relationships of my history and culture and people who are aligned with social justice causes and freedom causes. And so that has meant a lifestyle of such relationship building and connections, and continuing to share what that looks like in the practice, and inviting people to the movement work in different ways, by, welcoming history. History was really what woke me up. I mean, right? Like learning about history can really charge you in different ways. And so I think that part of the practice, it is important for folks to be invited to understand the history. I think knowledge is very powerful. And I think for especially for people of color, has certainly been erased. And so how folks are relearning and understanding or unlearning many things that maybe they have been told is a part of the journey, or the therapeutic healing journey towards liberation. Is we have to know what happened, right? And like many African sayings of Sankofa talk about, we have to kind of go backwards in order to know where we're going. That really is what ignites me, and what kind of sparked my reconnection with my church, to understand like what are, how come we're not talking about these things. And so that ultimately, because I have since like been involved in the church for about maybe a few years now. But this kind of this culture shift really changed the way that the church has felt power enough to maybe just do what they can, and that's about it. The fear has really the fear of what could happen to you has really froze people to not really involve themselves in certain causes, and that kind of discourages me to attend a church that has kind of had it, and we, not to say that it's their fault. I do put accountability on the fear of the government and what they instilled in the church and the community. But that meant for me connecting more with people who are maybe outside of the church doing that work.
Right. Well, how would you reconcile? So my experience of Christianity was utterly patriarchal, and that's one of the things that I'm still trying to shake off and wrap my head around. Was that anything that was present for you, or did you have any kind of awareness of that either while you were growing up or when you kind of reconnected in your college years?
Yeah, I mean, even in movement work, you see patriarchy, right? Like in social justice work, you might see like many men at the forefront are leaders, right? Historically, in movements, there is this like comfort with male leadership. But patriarchy isn't about like male leadership. It's about like violence, right? It's about power and dominance and control. So it's not just the male leadership part. That's just like the small piece. It's about what that male is doing, right? Like how that male is trying to achieve power, control, and dominance. And that's what I think patriarchy is, right? Patriarchy has shown up, in the way that it's assumed that the male has the leadership role. So the male is the pastor, and everybody looks at the pastor, right? We're all in the audience, and the pastor is in a space up front, right? Like saying the word, and that person doesn't get challenged. In my case, again, like I have a very different experience than maybe other people. This person, the pastor that pastored this church, or that continues to even, to this day, it does include education and other historical backgrounds. So again, this notion of like cultural historical context was always included in this setting. But what is very notable is that there's the male, right, like person that's leading the message. And what's very clear is that many of the women are like leading like the children ministry, for example, or leading the cooking, or serving. And so these like roles that are not like assigned are very much assumed. And the church majority is female. Majority of the members are female. And so it's notable of like the busy bees, like always kind of keeping it together. And so you see those kind of, right, like stereotypical roles of like the cooking, the cleaning, the serving, the children, nurturing the children. Are you going to get married? Are kind of the questions you're going to be asked if you're a female member versus a male member. things like that were also very like obvious. And the default of the pastor, like the know-all, right? Like that's the person that we have to ask, and but not that, but won't, isn't responsible for, like, I don't know, like following up or something like that. I guess it's very interesting. It's very interesting dynamic of like teacher, like of how even the school system, right, is like the teacher is at the front and we're all in the audience, and we're all kind of looking this way, and we're not looking at each other.
Right.
None of us.
It's different than if it was in a circle.
None of us are looking at each other.
Yeah.
And so, I think one of the biggest turnoffs for me in church was about that. Like, we're not really looking at each other. We're all looking at this one guy. So we don't get to have responsibility for our actions. We just get to hear what he's got to say.
Ooh.
And maybe we'll, like, be nice here at church, but outside of here, if you didn't connect to the words, you don't really hold the responsibility. So you can just keep doing your thing outside of church. And when you go and you're there, it's okay, right? Like everything doesn't matter anymore. Like Catholicism, right? Like you do your Holy Marys or whatever, like the rosaries, not to disrespect people who use that as a practice. But very much like an erasure of your rest of the week until you get to church on Sunday or until you do your confession. So there's not, like, I don't know, there's just this missing connection for me of what happens, when you're outside of this building and leaning into, the churches, the streets for me. I see church all around me. I am the church. I am the temple. And how do I recognize how important that is to take care of myself? That sometimes means I want to sleep in on Sundays. I don't want to go to church.
Yes. And
I'm tired and I want to take care of myself, but that came with guilt.
Yes.
That came with guilt and calls. Like, where are you? Are you running late? Are you on your way?
Yes.
And the unlearning of that pit of my stomach feeling on a Sunday, now that I'm not attending how I used to, was really a grief for me.
Yes.
A grieving process.
And I know one thing you and I were chatting about just before we got on here today was Dr. Naomi Norton was my guest a few weeks ago, and she shared her white evangelical wheel of power and control, which is an adaptation of a domestic violence wheel of power and control, basically. And I just thought that was so interesting and just right on point, because we're often not aware of the subtle ways that we are being manipulated and led in certain directions. And so when you say patriarchy is about violence and is about, what men do to stay in control, I think that is right on. And that's something that it's hard even to look at. It's so frustrating to look at because we don't like to admit it. And because sometimes we can feel powerless to make change. How can we even start to make change? And you and your colleagues at F.L.Y Radical Therapy, you are running different programs to educate, to expose clients to here's what patriarchy looks like. Here's what systemic oppression looks like. What's some of the work that you're doing in those places?
Yeah, thank you. So F.L.Y Radical Therapy has really been about what it means to love yourself in a way that understands or includes how systemic oppression has taught you to hate yourself. And so as a person of color, as a person who identifies as a woman or at times gender non-binary, part of the loving yourself first piece meant that I had to reconcile with who is telling me I'm not lovable. Like, how have I picked up on those messages? And that meant that I had to start creating boundaries with people. And that meant I had to start to lean into what I love about me. And that meant I had to challenge certain belief systems that existed and patterns that have existed. And so in the work that we do with F.L.Y Radical Therapy is we are all trained therapists. Most of us, we do have an herbalist that started as not a trained therapist, an herbalist. And so in the practice, nonetheless, we are aligned with understanding how loving yourself is an act of liberation as a person of color. As someone who is aligned with our work, like a person who is white identified and aligned with uplifting folks who are oppressed, and aligning and integrating their awareness, is how we can move towards healing and social liberation. Part of that looks different for everyone. It might look different, but as a whole, we encourage everyone that is a client of ours to share the information that they receive from our therapy, to invite and create and learn how to cultivate their own communities, which is very key. So we do the work here one-on-one. We create a container, support space, brave space for folks to find their ways through understanding how they've been affected by systemic oppression and patterns and ways that they are dealing with and ways that they are empowered to work through the goals that they have for themselves, and also how they're continuing to cultivate that with others is really key. We don't believe that healing happens alone. It has to happen in collective, but it also has to happen on your own. It has to be a responsible, you have to be radically responsible with your own self-care. And if you're having trouble with that, then you need other people to help you. And other people, ideally with their consent, are able to help you in the ways that they are capable of helping you. And so it means that not one person can save you. It means we all save each other and we all look out for each other because we all have different capacities and strengths and privileges and accesses, and needs. And so, I ultimately is about this way that we integrate with each other, to really be able to continue to spread that message of like empowering ourselves to change these systems, and to really hold these systems accountable in different ways, either within your own family, with yourself, or within your workplace, or maybe like within law changing, or within just creating something completely new that has nothing to do with the system that we already operate in. It's just like make a whole new space and radically dream of what that might look like. Maybe it is dialogue, like what we're doing. We're having space and dialogue together, and this is one of the ways that we are dismantling oppression, is by acknowledging that it exists. Right? Like all of us who live in the United States. I know you live in Canada, but like, if you live in the United States, you're inherently racist. It's just, let's just be honest with that. I was born into a racist society. I am racist. I was taught to be anti-Black and anti-Indigenous and anti-gay. I was taught that. I was taught to specifically don't interact with these folks, or this is how they are, or whatever the case may be. And these are things we have to acknowledge exists, because like ghosts, they're not going to go away if you pretend it's not there, right? You have to acknowledge its existence so that it can have less power over you in your life. And you're saying, you're actively, and we actively have to do this all the time.
Right.
This is something that we have to do kind of all the time. And I use the term womanism because this comes from the Black liberation movement. The Black liberation movement has really taught our society how to love yourself and everyone. But we have to acknowledge that this society has been built for some and not others.
Yes.
So even though we want the freedom for everyone, we have to also acknowledge that there have been some hierarchies here.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to be aware of those things. So even like being a Latinx person, there's powers and privileges that I have access to that maybe someone who is darker skinned than me might not have, or someone who is lower class or someone who is disabled might not have. And so I think like as we continue to grow and learn, these nuances that like religion has tried to simplify, like by just praying it out,
Right.
or just reading the Bible or just reading the word, like it's a tool that could be helpful for some people, but it can't be and should not be, because it's dangerous and irresponsible for us to just lean on this one thing to heal us.
And it can also be divisive. It can be very othering if we're talking in terms of us and them. You either believe or you don't believe. And depending which side you're on, one of those can have greater or lesser value. And we run into so much trouble there.
And it's been a great tool for oppression. It's been a great tool for oppression of people in all the isms. A great tool to oppress people who are darker skinned, people who are Black identified, people who are Indigenous and believe in the earth and the land, people who have had other or come with other cultural beliefs from their ancestors, like gods and deities. It's been a great tool to welcome the erasure of people and to kill and end people's entire societies and cultures. And so it can be very dangerous. It has been dangerous. It continues to be dangerous.
Yes.
And I think that because there's such a stronghold in our globe of Christianity, right? Like globally Christianity and has had this like worldly power. I think like it's our responsibility to acknowledge how we have benefited from it, right? Because I think people as a Christian, that's a privilege because it's a majority of what people identify as in the world. And there have been privileges that people have had, like prayer or like open prayer, like things that have just been easily accessible for people who identify as Christian or that have had access to. There's things in Christianity that you're familiar with, even if you don't go to church anymore, you're familiar with prayer.
Right.
You know about the Bible, you know about the stories. So you have access, right? There's like an in to some of those stories that you're familiar with.
Right.
We all have the day off for certain holidays.
Right.
So there's privileges that come with that. So I think, when we're thinking about healing and liberation, we have to recognize what privileges are we also willing to give up. And that's, as somebody who is white identified, that's very much the responsibility of folks who have that privilege.
Yes. Yeah. And I was very fortunate recently to attend at Syracuse University a conference on the religious origins of white supremacy and really looking at the papal doctrine of discovery and how that just the toxicity of that all around the world. But I'm so glad that white people are starting to acknowledge this and see this and call it out for what it is. I'm wondering, so at the F.L.Y Radical Therapy group, are all of your therapists or counselors, are they all Black, Indigenous, people of color? And do you have any Caucasian clients, or is it specifically you're reaching out to the BIPOC community?
We center Black, Indigenous, people of color, meaning that it's centering, like they're at the forefront. They'll always be the majority of the people that we serve. However, it's not limited to. We do have people who are white identified as clients as well.
Right.
Who have actively sought out the practice because of their aligned beliefs and values.
Yes. And so then part of the work that you're doing is educating about systemic oppression in various forms.
As well as white privilege, right? Because I think white privilege doesn't just apply to folks who identify as white. There are, again, colorism ideologies that like parallel white privilege. And then there's, classism that's real as well. And so, part of the responsibility for us as clinicians is to welcome and invite space to challenge people on their privileges as well. So folks who identify as white, what that might look like for them, and also recognizing where our limitations are to work with folks who identify as white as well. And so we have actively encouraged folks to participate in ally groups, meaning like folks who identify within their own, with folks who they can gather with that identify with their identity. So folks who in Chicago, we have a group called, or a program or organization called Truth, TRHT, Truth Racial Healing. I can't remember what the last T stands for, but essentially it's a group that is centered around allied groups that can meet within their spaces to have and unpack conversations on race. And so some folks that are in our practice are encouraged to attend something like that, or meet with other folks who are white identifying and have these conversations, because we have limits. I'm not, able to fully comprehend what that means. And this is also a limitation for both of us, right? And so I think that therapy can be a helpful entry point for some folks to understand the development of their own identity, the development of maybe what stage they might be in their racial identity, and how they can continue to develop and nurture that, and what might be some obstacles that might get in the way.
Wow.
Maybe
so powerful.
It's powerful. It's hard work. It's not easy, right? This is brave work, I think, because it's not easy to acknowledge that you have participated in some way towards oppression by maybe even being complicit. Some people may not have actively been a racist person, like overtly,
right, but
have maybe been complicit when like family members were, right? Or maybe in other ways, right? There's microaggressions that exist. Some people that I have known that identify as white have, maybe been also community members and very much social justice like oriented, are still dealing with their own nuanced ways that are inherently racist. So there might be subtle acts of like, clenching the purse when like a person of color walks by. That's like in our behavior, that's in our psyche to be anti this person. So those are ways that like, again, it has to happen like all the time. And it's not easy to actively always think about this, which makes it so challenging. But as people of color, it's what we all deal with all the time.
And so then as a Canadian, when I see what's going on in the different states, like in Florida, and, white people are up in arms about the critical race theory, and though we can't possibly actually teach the truth of what happened, that the country was built on slavery, that is so I mean, it's like you're making progress, and then there's this huge wall that just I mean, I'm frustrated by that, and you know, what I have in the game, it seems like a far less than people who actually are Black, Indigenous, or people of color who have to deal with this every day. It's just got to be intensely frustrating at times.
It's frustrating. It's all the feelings, right? That's why we have to, that's why this practice is centering people of color and making sure that people who are maybe white identifying are taking responsibility and active responsibility in how they're uplifting other marginalized communities in their healing work, because that is healing, right? Like if somebody is oppressed, and you're not affected by it, that's a problem. Or if you think that you're not affected by it, that's a problem, because that means that you're okay with other people not being free because you've benefited from it and you haven't felt it yourself.
Wow.
That's a problem across a lot of issues that we have, I think, in society.
Wow, that really breaks it down. Even you just saying it like that, if you're not troubled by somebody being oppressed, then that is a problem. That's so powerful. Can you tell me what role do you see art playing? So I'm thinking art like drawing and painting, but also poetry, writing, these sorts of things. What role do you see that having in helping educate people and helping liberate people?
Yeah, I think art has a beautiful way of welcoming and inviting interpretation without like it being so direct, or maybe it is so direct that you have to feel it. Art is about, I think, feeling. And I think it goes so well with therapy because therapy is about feeling. It's not about intellectualizing your feelings, even though we do that. But it's about feeling, like let it sit and simmer with you, like let it touch you, let it hurt you, let it like soothe you. It's about like what feelings are coming up for you. And I think that is such a powerful and important part of therapy or therapeutic healing, is to feel the feeling or express that feeling. It's so important to have space to let it out in some way, and visualize it, depict it, articulate it. And so art in its many forms, right? I'm more into writing, and poetry is something that comes very natural for me. But I'm also performance or acting or theater, song, color. These are all ways that I think historically people lean into for healing. All of us lean into art or creativity for entertainment or to feel something, or to feel something different, maybe, right? And so I think that the role of art in therapy it has to be intersected some way. And so in our practice, we invite those ways. We invite people to think creatively in how they're able to nurture their creativity, nurture play even, because that's how we tap into joy. That's how we understand joy, or maybe that's how we can really see our pain, because we feel it, or maybe we don't know it's there and we're just used to it. But when we put it on paper, it's like, oh, I didn't know it looked like this. So I think it could be a really helpful way to maybe even, I don't want to say measure our feelings, but just allow ourselves to to feel. I think one of the biggest challenges that I have and work with, and I'm sure you experience, is that with clients who are terrified of feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well,
Yeah.
talk it away and excuse it away or distract it away, but to sit with it, to sit with the guilt, it's very detrimental for some people.
And anger is another big one that people are very uncomfortable with. But in some ways, I think they may even be more uncomfortable with sorrow and guilt. But anger is more accessible, or it's more
it's power.
acceptable.
It's power.
Yeah, power. There's power in anger, but that doesn't feel like there's power in grief and sorrow.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I think that people in our society, again, like this is what patriarchy and what we're all kind of dealing with, is that violence has been how an acceptable way to express anger and injustice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
For some people, but not others. So it's really interesting how we're all witnessing a genocide,
Right.
very global media, recorded genocide, and how acceptable this religious-based, patriarchal-filled genocide is being enacted before all of our eyes in such a matter-of-fact way. But if certain people enact violence in that way, what happens to them? If certain people enact, and we see this in the United States, like white males would maybe have a gun and not be shot down, or maybe chased and arrested and perhaps put behind, cuffs and behind a car. But if this is a Black identified person, they're shot down.
Oh, yeah.
So it's so confusing who gets to participate in patriarchy.
Wow, yeah.
Who gets to not participate? And again, how do people benefit? And so it's power and control. I think, again, like reminding that patriarchy is about dominating, oppressing, right? And what I think is the antithesis is womanism, and equality or equity, and not just equality. It has to be equity. Equity is recognizing that this has been an unleveled playing field, and that we have to recognize the nuances between all of us. And we have to kind of elevate as we see fit and responsible. So I do believe more in equity and how we're honoring the nuances. And we have to recognize the nuances, because it's not very clear cut and black and white, like we think it is.
Right.
It's easier to think in that way and compartmentalize, I think, right? Black and white thinking. But as therapists, we have to be responsible that our brain has more capacity and can stretch. And let's use these tools to stretch the brain so we can invite some different ways of thinking and doing.
Yeah. Oh, I love it. And I think I'm going to end us on that note. This has been such an educational and really eye-opening, very interesting conversation. Dorian, how can people find you or find F.L.Y Radical Therapy?
FLYradicaltherapy.com is the website. We're also on Instagram at F.L.Y Radical Therapy. And people can read more about what we're doing on the page, and read more about the work. We have therapists who are not just therapists. most of the therapists that work who with the practice, most of us also do speaking engagements. We also do workshops. This is our third year running a youth program called the Heal Academy, which stands for Honey, Education, and Love. And we have raised funds to pay them to learn about healing and wellness in a 4-week program where they're exposed to a professional licensed therapist as well as a healer of a variety of types of healing. And they are paid to participate. And so we intentionally seek out folks who are BIPOC, LGBTQ youth between, I think this year we lowered the age to 13 to 17. And this year was our biggest cohort where we combined a group who were mostly Latinx as well as Black identified and lived across cities. So one group lived in one part of the city, the other group was in another part of the city, and we did this hybrid workshop series. And so we're really looking forward to the future of how we are investing in these young people who have really been going through it. The pandemic was really hard on these resilient young people, but also how we're providing space for adults who are also going through a really hard time, who are responsible for the young people. So we're looking to continue to grow our work and our networks with different folks to continue to find ourselves through liberation of this oppressed, this wild shit.
Yeah, it really is. And I saw on your website, people can support by buying T-shirts for the Heal Academy.
Yes, the Heal Academy has a T-shirt sale. We also have herbal tinctures for sale as well. We will have some sweatshirts up on the shop soon. And so people can support by shopping in our little store. The tinctures are nerve tonic tinctures created by our herbalists to help with anxiety and depression through this dark time.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dorian, thank you so much for joining me today. And I hope our paths will cross again. I know that I've learned a lot today, and I'm sure I'll hear that from others who are watching as well. So thanks again.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to connecting as well. This has been a really helpful and insightful path that you're on. So I'm glad that you found me, and lately is been certainly a topic of discussion for many of us in the practice, as well as the clientele that we're seeing. And so thank you for the work that you're doing to really raise awareness for folks and naming religious trauma as your participation and contribution to liberation. So thank you.
Oh, it's just my pleasure to do it. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.